Asymmetrical Haircuts Justice Update with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
So for the last podcast before we take a month's break, I wanted to take you somewhere special. Just picture a lovely garden at the UK Embassy in The Hague.
Just to reassure listeners, we're not completely out of your lives through the summer. Instead, one of our interns has picked some favourites for you, so our feed won't be empty. But Steph, back in the garden. I've been there. It's quite a nice large garden. I was there for a national day once, the King's birthday. What were you doing in the embassy garden?
Well, I was let in because I was there to attend the unveiling of a statue for the victims of conflict-related sexual violence, which is billed as the first permanent statue for all survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, which is briefly in The Hague, and it will then make a kind of tour of European cities before finally getting a permanent home in Wassenaar, the very fancy town next to The Hague, where a lot of the ambassadors live. I'll let the Steph of a couple of weeks ago set the scene, and as you can hear here, I'm not really a radio journalist because I sound very furtive, like I'm secretly recording, and that's probably just because I'm embarrassed to be seen talking into a microphone. I'm sitting here on the lawn of the British Embassy's residence in The Hague, looking at the sculpture that is about to be unveiled. You will hear some construction in the background. The building next door is being revamped, and we have some cars of diplomats running on and off for this event. The statue is now in the garden of the residence, and it's about life size. It looks like a woman who is encased in tree roots, with openings in between, and there are small items kind of caught between the roots, and apparently these have a particular significance, but hopefully we will speak to the sculptor and she will explain some of what it means. But right now I'm looking at some of the women survivors of conflict-related sexual violence who are here and looking at the statue and having explained to them what is happening. And these women, a lot of them also know each other from other events and are part of this survivors network that the Mukwege Foundation has built up.
I appreciate very much you setting the scene. Steph, you mentioned there the Mukwege Foundation. I'm sure we'll come back to them and who they are and their involvement. But first, why don't you tell me about who made the statue and why?
Well, this memorial was an idea of the British sculptor Rebecca Hawkins, who worked on it for 3 years with the help of over 20 survivor organizations for victims from over 30 countries from all over the world. And when I spoke to her, she also mentioned being inspired by the Christina Lamb 2020 book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, which we reviewed on our Patreon War Criminals Book Club last year. And I asked Rebecca to talk me through her process and show me her sculpture. So you'll hear us walk around the garden as she explains what we're seeing.
So we, over the last 3 years, have reached out to about 25 different organizations and shared with them questionnaires aimed at gaining symbolism about strength and what women and men feel about what's happened to them, but in an effort not to traumatize them. It's been all symbol based. And the majority of survivors talked about trees and mountains as their symbols for strength, which is why it starts off with such a wide base and goes up into a tree. So it's quite mountainous in its shape and then goes up into this woman. The idea about the Petrified survivors title was that there was a woman from Vietnam who said that when she was raped she felt so petrified that she couldn't move, and it felt like a perfect way of describing what happens to somebody's life when they're raped, because it is petrified. They are unable to move on and bloom until they get help and that there's healing or they get justice. But for the majority of survivors, they're not getting help or justice. So the metaphor for what happens to somebody's life after rape has been described by strangler fig vine here, which is a parasitic vine that drops a seed in the top of a host tree. It sends tendrils down and slowly strangles the tree inside it, which, from what I've read, accurately describes what rape does to somebody's future. All the vines have symbols from each different survivor group around the world tied into them, a bit like those trees that you see where people have etched their words and tied little mementos in. And so all the survivors' words are etched into every part of this memorial. And yet the woman at the top is looking up to the sky for hope. Her lips are sewn, which was chosen by Bosnian survivors, talking about the stigma and inability to talk about what's happened to them. And she has a butterfly for hope of change sitting on her shoulder. Within the branches, there's a phoenix sitting there, quietly giving her strength and resilience. So many survivors chose a phoenix and said a phoenix should be part of it to talk about rising from the ashes. And round the back, shall I show you?
I also see a lot of flowers entwined, different flowers.
Yeah.
I see orchids, tulips,
The orchid
hibiscus.
is, for Sudanese survivors, chose an orchid because of its ability to survive with nothing and still to bloom. Yeah, there are hibiscus. Every different organisation has chosen a different symbol, and so many survivors said that fruits and flowers should be involved in the memorial because it showed resilience and beauty and purity and a quest for new life. At the back, her hands are bound, but a dove is flying to release her hands. And she has a baby strapped to her back, which has little symbols etched into the papoose, which are little suns, because a lot of survivors asked for sunshine as an emblem of hope.
And what was the most surprising thing to you that you were asked to include or that you read and thought, okay?
There were various flowers that I'd never heard of before, which were quite complicated and a struggle. But there was a male survivor from Syria who was kept in darkness for the whole of his incarceration, and he talked about how the only way he knew that he was changing was by putting his hand up to his face. And so I didn't know how to represent that particularly. Also, there's a symbol of a lion, so men are much harder to bring into a healing process because there's so much stigma surrounding it, but they're less likely to ask for help and find help. But everything that I researched and spoke to with the organisations helping them spoke about how demasculinated they felt, and that was a real struggle to work out a symbol for. But we came up with a lion with half his mane sheared off, so that's this one here. Which talks about how they feel about the loss of masculinity. I think this one's interesting at the back, this cloth that she's clasping a cloth. There were survivors from Central African Republic who suggested that she should be holding a loincloth so that she has something to lie down on when she stops running.
That's quite an intense process for you as a sculptor. I don't know if this is the kind of sculptor that you normally do, but I imagine that there's a lot of emotion also from you in this.
Yeah, it's been such an emotional journey. I had worked on 2 memorials before, one for survivors in Vietnam called the Lai Dai Han, and that was my first kind of foray into finding out more about this subject matter. And it's one of those subjects that once you know that it's happening, you can't unknow it, and you can't believe that you've been so blind. And how did you not know that this is happening to such large swathes in the world? I've been working with this for a while, but this one has been particularly intense. It's got so many words which are difficult and really stop you in your tracks. And it's been incredible, but at every point you have to remember this isn't my life. This is actually happening to a real person out there. So it's not for me to be knocked sideways by it, but it is for people to do something about it if they feel that way.
In that last bit, Rebecca mentions words that are difficult, and she means that quite literally, because in addition to all the symbols that we talked about that are on the statue, there's also a lot of literal words carved into all the surfaces of the statue, and they are words of hope, but also of despair and horror.
It sounds really striking. I mean, I'm really getting the picture here of the symbolism of the different choices that have been made. I'm the kind of person who has favourite statues in any city. I mean, partly that's aesthetics, but partly it's also how significant they are and kind of the history that they represent. Should we just fill in a bit more of the backstory here? We should explain that the Mukwege Foundation, which is based both in The Hague as well as in the Democratic Republic of Congo, was set up by its founder, Denis Mukwege, who was a doctor who jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work with survivors of sexual violence in the DRC.
Yeah, and part of the Mukwege Foundation, a significant part that we run into a lot, you and I, in our kind of work, is the SEMA network, which is the global networks of victims and survivors to end wartime sexual violence. It's a group of about 70 plus core members, and they participate in national and international discussions, and they try to influence policy and push for justice and systemic change.
Yeah, one thing that I find really interesting, I mean, you talk about them influencing policy, but I also find that they really have this sense of solidarity across conflicts because they're from very different conflicts. But because they're all survivors, there's this kind of core link that they have across these communities.
Yeah, and you, I think, have seen them also in they have a choir of survivors of sexual and gender-based violence where they sing from all different countries together, which is quite impressive to see. I was also in this statue quite struck by the very deliberate inclusion of male victims. I was reminded, and even with all the podcasts we do about conflict-related sexual violence, of course, this mainly happens to women, but it also happens to men. And for men, the stigma is sometimes even worse than for women. And I'm always struck by the fact that one expert once told me that male survivors of sexual violence, if they say anything at all about what happened to them, they will classify it as torture rather than saying that they were sexually assaulted, which I found very remarkable.
It kind of links back to so many different of the themes that we keep covering in the podcast, like the sexual torture in conflict one that we did with Alice Edwards, the special rapporteur on torture. CRSV itself, we did a basic primer with Kim Tay-Selinger and Valerie Oosterveld. Way back, we did a podcast with JJ Wangui in Kenya about the lack of justice for men and women who'd suffered from sexual violence in the post-election violence. I mean, that was a really big case at the ICC. We even had the president and separately the vice president facing different kinds of charges at one point, but those cases collapsed. So kind of really the sense that it's a constant wave within our work.
One of the women I spoke to at the unveiling of this monument was somebody I'd met before, Jackie Muterte from Kenya, who I'd met before on events talking about getting justice. And I asked her whether this statue is also maybe a counterweight for vast numbers of statues in towns and cities that somehow celebrate war or remember war, but they're always mainly men and created by men. So I asked her about that.
You will go into a city or you will get into an airport and you will go on the main highway or in specific locations of a city and you'll see sculptures of either the men who went to war, men who won the war perhaps a man with a victory flag, symbols of some sort of victory. But where in the world did you ever find the symbol of a woman who has gone through something, who went also through the war and who has also come out victorious? So the war that women have fought is one of sexual violence, that she holds the scar in her body. But where in the world will you find a sculpture or a statue that speaks about the pain that she's undergone, about the scars and the wounds that she's holding, that she's carrying, that she's healing from? Nowhere in the world. But this sculpture represents that which the war women have gone through sexual violence. That is what I was meaning.
And you yourself are a survivor. What does it mean to you to have this sculpture is going to be in the Dutch municipality of Wassenaar? People are going to walk past it. What do you want people who walk past it to take away from it?
The effects of war on women's bodies. And what happens to a woman happens to a community. If you break a woman, you've broken a community. As it is in the municipality, it's a great thing because this is the city of justice and peace. There is no problem with that. But I am here today to affirm that my hand and my voice and my words and the other survivors and the survivors of the children that were born from the sexual violence are reflected in this majestic sculpture, and that the world will listen and hear and understand and help us to speak and to stand.
And who most needs to see this sculpture, do you think?
I think everybody needs to see it, but mostly government people, people who make decisions, people who speak, who talk about money, who speak about money, who speak about war, who speak about justice, who speak about peace, who speak about government, and those who also hold the money to build and to restore communities. Those are the ones that need to. But above all, also, we appreciate the support of our fellow global citizens who will see and add their hand and add their voice to affirming the sculpture.
I also asked Jackie to tell us about the legal process she's been through and how that compares with the efforts to build memorials and focal points for commemoration like this statue.
Going through a legal process is what is expected because you're seeking justice. The normal process is good to go through a court process. And so we went through that in Kenya, and we got a judgment that we did not personally find very favorable. Out of eight survivors that were representing all the survivors that are mentioned in our Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission report, they represented us, but only out of the eight, only four got a favorable ruling, got compensation. But the compensation also has not still been paid 4 years after the ruling, and so that is just one part of the process of reparations for sexual violence. How memorialization comes in. Memorialization is a personal thing. It is honoring the women, first of all, who we have lost to sexual violence, who have passed away. It is in honor of the children who have died as a result of sexual violence. It is an honor to those who continue in the fight for justice, and it is a symbol that justice shall be served, and that no story should ever be left untold.
You are also part of the SEMA Survivors Network. You've started up that plan to have this global reparations. Yes. How is that going?
The agenda is still on. We're still on. First of all, we're building solidarity. We've got our focus on ensuring that the world knows that we say no to sexual violence, that our aspiration is that sex should not be weaponized, and that women's bodies are no longer going to be a battlefield for men to abuse. And so that is the SEMA Global Survivors Network agenda, to first of all hold perpetrators accountable, for there to be accountability, for there to be holistic care, and to seek reparations and justice for the sexual violence. But above all, also to amplify our voices together, that the voice in Colombia and the voice in South Africa and the voice in West Africa, the voice in East Africa, the voice in Asia, all just says end sexual violence.
Thank you. And
that there should be nothing about us without us.
Since you did that interview, Steph, we actually got some news out from Kenya that the 4 survivors Jackie mentions there are actually finally getting physically this compensation from the government. And we'll put a link to that news in the show notes.
That's amazing because, yes, she was talking about how much she wanted that. That's over a decade that they're waiting for all of this.
It also made me think about kind of that bigger picture you were speaking to her about reparations in general. We know that there's a global push on that, but I was looking back and it was actually the second ever pod that we did was with Lorraine Smith Van Lin, who was at that point working for Redress, and they brought out a big report about reparations for survivors generally and especially survivors of sexual violence and what wasn't working. I mean, really that sense of what's not working. I mean, deja vu, has it changed?
I also think that we talk so much about reparations, and whenever you speak to survivors and victims, it's one of the things they find most important. And at the same time, it's one of the things that we kind of see the least progress in, or it's for such a small group that you wonder if you should even mention that there is a possibility for reparations, because the people that might actually get it they're so extremely limited by all kinds of factors that, you wonder if we're not trying to, in Dutch you can say, make somebody happy with a dead bird, that you're promising something that you're probably never ever going to get.
I was going to say that it feels like sometimes it's a bit of sticking plaster at the end. And I think we should look ahead sort of in the next year of podcasts that we do, that we really should spend some attention to issues of reparations, because like our main bread and butter, the International Criminal Court, there are lots of issues there. Finally, what are your final thoughts that you want to leave everybody with as we go on a short break for ourselves now?
When I was putting together the audio for this, I was struck by something that the sculptor said, Rebecca, where she explained that once she heard about this ongoing problem of conflict-related sexual violence, that it's very hard to unknow, and she really wanted to do something about it. And I think with everything that's happening around the world, and especially in the Gaza Strip at the moment, it is kind of hard to live with the knowledge that you see things happening and that you know something is happening, and that it's hard to do something about it except for draw attention to it. If you want to see the sculpture and you're in The Hague until the end of August, I think it is now still at the Deutsche Evangelische Gemeinde, which doesn't sound very Dutch, but it is in The Hague, and it's on Blijenburg 3.
And I think, as you said later, it will come to Wassenaar, so I'm sure we'll update the notes for this, our website, and make sure that we note when it does come back to our part of the world.
Yeah, I think it's in about 2 years, because it was unveiled in the garden of the UK embassy, but that's undergoing renovations, and so it was unveiled, stayed there for a week, and then was whisked away to the German church in The Hague.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.